There's something no one ever told you about reality, not because they don't know, but because they don't want you to find out. A truth so unsettling, so profoundly transformative that if known by all, it would dismantle millennia-old structures of power, faith, and identity. And according to documents hidden for centuries, this truth was not only within reach of science, but also in the hands of men who wore sacred robes and spoke in the name of God. What if I told you the reality you live in is not a reflection of the external world, but a construction shaped by symbolic codes, mental patterns, and subtle frequencies that influence everything, from your thoughts to your most intimate choices? What if I told you that a pope, one of the most influential men in modern history, had access to this knowledge, and that it was all buried under ritualistic silence? This video will follow the trail of that hidden secret through forgotten manuscripts, concealed symbols, and dangerous intersections between neuroscience, quantum physics, and deep spirituality. What follows will help you understand why you've never heard anything about this, and how this secret could change everything. Imagine walking through silent hallways where the smell of aged paper blends with the invisible weight of millennia of secrets. The Vatican Apostolic Library isn't just a historical archive, it's a spiritual vault. Guarded by high walls and constant surveillance, it holds documents that could change the way we understand existence. But why such strict protection? What could be so dangerous that it's locked away and hidden even from the most devoted eyes? Among the hidden records, there are manuscripts that speak of a non-local reality, a term that resonates with the findings of quantum physics, where everything is connected by invisible threads of consciousness. These texts don't belong solely to the Christian faith. Some come from ancient Egypt, others from Sufi teachings, and some even trace back to the early Gnostics. But all of them speak, in surprisingly similar ways, of a single principle. The world we see is a reflection of what we believe to be true. So, who is shaping that reflection? Accounts indicate that certain popes had access to these documents and understood, in silence, a devastating truth. Reality is not solid, but programmable. Thoughts, symbols, words, all act as commands, configuring the human experience. Now, think, if someone knew this, would they use it to liberate or to control? What if faith, as taught over the centuries, was a carefully crafted belief system designed to keep the mind in a predictable cycle of guilt, hope, and submission? Today, neuroscience confirms that the brain filters reality based on pre-established beliefs. Religion, in turn, has always served as a major shaper of those beliefs. What if these two fields are actually talking about the same thing, just in different ways? Doctrines and dogmas could be seen as software running inside the human mind, with each ritual functioning as a maintenance code. But maintenance of what exactly? The soul, faith, or something much deeper? Unofficial reports suggest that during the Second Vatican Council, a small group had access to part of these writings and secretly debated whether the world was ready for such a revelation. The decision was unanimous: absolute silence. Humanity, they claimed, still couldn't distinguish freedom from chaos. But was that decision made out of care, or fear of losing control over the masses? After all, if every person discovered they are a co-creator of reality, how many structures would collapse? Those documents are still there, hidden among volumes with Latin titles and dusty covers, stored, not by chance, far from common eyes. But maybe, just maybe, someone has already read more than they were supposed to. And what happens when a secret like this starts to leak through the cracks of silence? In the year 999, a pope named Sylvester II wrote a letter. But it wasn't an ordinary letter. It was a ciphered, enigmatic message addressed to all those who dare to open the eyes of the soul. Sylvester II was not just a religious leader. He was a mathematician, astronomer, and deep student of Eastern mysteries. Many saw him as an alchemist disguised as a theologian, and his letter, kept for centuries and hidden from the public, contained a warning that still gives chills to those who read between the lines. The veil that covers the eyes is not of flesh, but of vibration. That sentence alone carries an unsettling weight. Vibration? In the 10th century? How could a pope speak in terms so aligned with what we now call quantum physics and energy fields? The letter's content suggests he believed in a vibrational structure of reality, where what we call the physical world is merely the densest manifestation of an invisible network of consciousness. And more, he claimed that certain words, when combined with intention, could open portals of perception. What kind of knowledge was this? And where did it come from? Some scholars claim Sylvester II had access to Arab and Persian manuscripts during his time in Cordoba, one of the esoteric knowledge capitals of the time. Others say he was in contact with desert monks who spoke of a language of the soul, a universal code older than words, resonating at the frequency of the heart. What if the Pope was trying to warn the world that we live under a kind of collective spell, an illusion shaped by mental patterns repeated generation after generation? But the letter was never delivered. It mysteriously vanished for nearly 1,000 years until it was mentioned by a German researcher in the early 20th century. Fragments of it were found in a secret archive of the Vatican Library and, according to this scholar, reveal an early attempt to break from the model of external faith and return to human beings the ability to perceive reality for themselves. The Pope, it seems, wanted to initiate a radical transformation, but someone stopped him. The question that echoes ever since is, why would such a message be considered dangerous? Perhaps because it shifted the power of truth from the altar to within each individual. Imagine the impact of that in a medieval society where the social structure depended on obedience and centralized faith. If each person could see for themselves, who would still bow down? The silence surrounding the letter seems to say much more than its content. It's as if the fear of spiritual freedom outweighed the desire for revelation. And what if the letter wasn't lost, but hidden by choice? Who else read it? And what did they decide to do with what they discovered? In an era when everything was passed on by speech, the word was more than communication. It was creation. The ancients knew this. In the oldest traditions, from the Indian Vedas to the Hebrew Kabbalistic texts, there are mentions of a language, of power, capable of shaping realities, healing, or destroying. It's no coincidence that Genesis begins with, "Let there be light," as if the world was born from a vocal command. But what if that idea wasn't just symbolic? What if certain words really did activate hidden structures of the mind and matter? Recent research in neuroscience shows that language directly affects the limbic system, the area of the brain responsible for emotions. Words like peace or hate produce distinct physiological reactions even when we don't consciously perceive them. The mind responds to language as if it were an operating code. Now imagine the impact of this when used with ritualistic precision by people who know exactly what they're doing. What the ancients called sacred word might, in fact, have been a forgotten technology. And here's the point few dare to discuss. Many religious rituals, including Catholic ones, use ancient words in languages no one understands anymore. Latin, Aramaic, ancient Greek. Why? Is it just tradition? Or do those words carry frequencies that act below the threshold of consciousness? There's a reason liturgy kept Latin as a sacred language for so long. Something beyond aesthetics or symbolism. There are reports from priests who describe emotional changes in the faithful just by hearing certain chants. But the Vatican's most hidden documents suggest something even bolder. In writings that never reached the public, there's mention of a sequence of lost words, a vocal set that supposedly awakens the mind to a non-linear reality. These texts speak of a living language, resonating with the very structure of the universe. Could it be that sounds were used for centuries to induce a kind of collective trance? And what if prayer isn't just supplication, but programming? Deep. Psychology reinforces this idea. Constant repetition of words creates mental patterns that become fixed in the unconscious. That's why mantras work, why political slogans stick in your mind, why certain speeches manipulate crowds. What if the words used in temples, churches, and cathedrals were carefully chosen not just for what they mean, but for what they do? Words shape perception, and whoever controls language controls the inner world. But one question hangs in the air, uncomfortable and almost forbidden. If there is a language that activates consciousness, who is using it in silence while everyone else just listens? From childhood, we're taught that reality is something external, solid, immutable, that the world is out there, waiting to be observed. But this view, taught as absolute truth, may be nothing more than a mental construct upheld by an invisible consensus. Many thinkers, from Plato to Jung, pointed to the same riddle. We see what we believe we see. And when everyone believes the I, same thing, that thing starts to seem real. But is it real, or merely accepted? In modern physics, the concept of objective reality is being challenged with every new experiment. The famous double-slit test shows that particles change their behavior when observed. That means the observer's mind directly influences what happens in the physical world. And if that's true on the quantum level, what stops it from applying to everyday experience? Do we create the world with our gaze, or with the beliefs behind our gaze? Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious, a shared psychic field where ideas, fears, and symbols are passed down through generations. This field acts like a filter, selecting what we're able to perceive and ignoring the rest. Within this system, religion played a crucial role, organizing collective thought and creating a kind of shared reality. But what if this wasn't just a symbolic construct, and instead a real invisible containment mechanism operating like a firewall for consciousness? In rare documents found in Vatican archives, there is mention of something called the consensus field, a concept that describes reality as a collective mental mirror, constantly calibrated by symbols, words, and rituals. According to these records, anything that doesn't enter this field is labeled heresy, madness, or fantasy. The human mind, then, would not only be an observer of the world, but a prisoner of a carefully maintained illusion. By whom? These same documents suggest that certain religious rituals are not merely ceremonies of faith, but active mechanisms for maintaining shared reality. They reinforce the same ideas, repeat the same stories, and consolidate the perception of what is real and what is not. Whoever controls the rituals shapes the field, and whoever shapes the field controls human experience. That would explain why certain spiritual leaders, when questioning this model, were silenced, excommunicated, or forgotten by history. And what if everything we call real is just the reflection of a much older and deeper program? What happens when someone wakes up and realizes reality was just a choice made by others? Have you ever wondered why certain religious images provoke an immediate sense of reverence, even in people with no religious belief? There's something in the eyes of the statues, in the stained glass, in the arches and domes that seems to reach a silent place within the mind. That's no coincidence. Sacred images were created to access a specific part of the psyche, a place that doesn't respond to logic but to symbolism, a place that doesn't think, it feels. In psychology, this phenomenon is known as symbolic resonance. Images charged with meaning activate deep archetypes, universal forms that live in the collective unconscious. Carl Jung said that religious symbols are not just cultural expressions, but living structures that speak to the soul. And medieval sacred artists knew this. Their stained glass, frescoes, and sculptures weren't just made for decoration. They were psycho-spiritual tools, carefully designed to instruct, indoctrinate, and shape. Modern neuroscience has been confirming this effect. Certain geometric patterns, like those found in rose windows or mandalas, activate areas of the brain linked to emotion, memory, and even the sense of belonging. It's no coincidence that Gothic churches were designed with precise mathematical proportions that induce an altered state of perception. Sacred space is mind architecture. Once inside, we are guided, without realizing it, to a receptive, almost hypnotic state. But what few people know is that there are internal Vatican records that describe iconography as a means of vibrational transmission. These documents state that sacred art was designed to be more than aesthetic. It encodes energetic instructions. Images of angels, saints, and demons would function as visual keys to unlock layers of the unconscious. That completely changes the way we understand visual faith. We are not just contemplating, we are being programmed. And what if these images weren't just expressions of devotion, but subtle interfaces between the mind and the symbolic field that sustains reality? Repeated exposure to these symbols shapes not just what we believe, but how we believe. Faith, then, wouldn't be something spontaneous, but induced by an invisible design that operates through aesthetics. The Pope, the bishops, the cardinals, all took part in constructing this system. But who created the codes? And with what intention? After all, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, what happens when 1,000 pictures are saying the same thing without you noticing? Inside the Vatican, there's a place that almost no one knows about. It doesn't appear on official maps or guided tours. They call it the room with no name, no icon, no cross, no image of Christ, Mary, or the saints. Just stone, silence, and an energy that those few who entered describe as irresistibly dense. Oral tradition among monks and veteran guards says this was the only place where popes could be silent before God. But what if that wasn't just a metaphor? There are records, protected by vows of silence, indicating that this room was built following sacred geometry instructions, an architecture designed not to impress, but to induce altered states of consciousness. It was positioned precisely over a specific energy point, like a circuit on an invisible map. A node in the network, as one internal 17th century document described it. And the popes who entered knew, inside that room, the mind doesn't command. It listens. Meditation alone is already a powerful process, but practiced in an environment with such characteristics, it becomes something different, almost a spiritual interface. Some reports speak of visions, inner voices, insights so profound that certain pontiffs would emerge in complete silence for days. Was this the place where the most serious decisions were made, or where the veil of reality was lifted for a moment? And what does a trained mind see when the mental world falls completely silent? Monks who served alongside the popes for centuries say only a few leaders were allowed to enter alone. A certain kind of preparation was required. It wasn't just about faith, but a specific type of internal discipline. The silence of the room wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something more subtle, harder to describe. A frequency only audible to those who knew how to listen with another part of their being, and those who returned from there didn't always return the same. This raises an uncomfortable question. What was seen inside that room that could never be put into words? Some scholars suggest that deep mystical experiences occurred there, perhaps even encounters with what we would now call fields of information. When consciousness is freed from external interference, it seems to tune into something greater, more expansive, and the Vatican always knew this. The room was not a place for reflection. It was an inner portal, carefully guarded. But if there was a space where the mind could touch truth without interference, what exactly was felt there, and why was it never revealed to the world? In the mid-20th century, something began quietly disturbing the Vatican's halls. It wasn't a religious revolt, nor a political scandal. It was something even more dangerous. Science was beginning to say things that had once belonged solely to the domain of spirit. Researchers were talking about quantum entanglement, particles connected at a distance, the role of the observer in the creation of reality. Suddenly, physics seemed to echo ancient mystical teachings, and that made many people uncomfortable, including within the church. For centuries, faith and science walked on opposite sides, as if one had to deny the other to exist. But now, cutting-edge studies were beginning to suggest that reality is malleable, and that thought, intention, and human consciousness play a fundamental role in the fabric of the universe. That meant the world was no longer an immutable divine creation, but an interactive, co-created structure. Imagine the impact of that idea in a system that depends on hierarchy and absolute authority. The Vatican, silently, began to gather physicists, theologians, and philosophers to discuss what was happening. The risk was clear. If the general public began to understand that faith was no longer a matter of dogma, but of conscious interaction with reality, the entire edifice of traditional religion could begin to shake. There was even an expression used in restricted circles: the collapse of the sacred. Not because spirituality would die, but because it would cease to be exclusive and become accessible to anyone who dared to look within. Some popes saw this as a threat, others as an opportunity. Confidential records mention meetings with scientists like Fritjof Capra and even internal discussions about how to incorporate this new view into Christian thought. But there was a line that could not be crossed. To reveal too much meant giving up control. So the decision was strategic. Absorb what could be absorbed, but keep the mystery intact. Speak of reconciling faith and science without ever admitting that they might have been talking about the same thing all along. Spirituality, according to this new view, was no longer about worshiping something outside of oneself, but about awakening something within. And physics was beginning to support this idea with equations. The quantum field, the source of all possibilities, sounded dangerously similar to the mystical concept of divine unity. Prayer and meditation, now seen as consciousness technologies, and free will, once a moral concept, became a tool of creation. But what could the church do in the face of this, other than remain silent? After all, if faith and science were saying the same thing in different words, why would anyone fight so hard to keep that connection a secret? John Paul: I held the throne of Peter for only 33 days. Officially, it was a heart attack. But to this day, many refuse to accept that explanation as sufficient. Something about his death seems too abrupt, too quiet, too convenient. During his short papacy, he is said to have had access to a document called the Codex Submentalis, a manuscript kept far from public view, which treated the human mind not as a mechanism, but as a portal. And from all accounts, it shook him deeply. This document described something disturbing: that reality can be shaped by unconscious structures, and that certain religious rituals, if understood in their original essence, function as psychic commands, not to connect with God, but to reprogram perception. It is said that after reading the text, John Paul IV spent hours in seclusion, speaking to no one. One of his assistants reported seeing him staring into the void as if he had seen something no one should ever see. But what could be so impactful to a man already familiar with the sacred? The details of the Codex suggest that traditional faith was built upon fragments of a much older and more dangerous knowledge. A knowledge about the power of the human mind, intention, the vibration of words and images, of everything that operates beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. John Paul I is believed to have understood that if this came to light, the very structure of the church could collapse. But he also seemed inclined to speak out, to guide the faithful not as sheep, but as co-creators of reality. According to confidential sources, he planned to radically reform the catechism, including concepts from deep psychology, full awareness, and spiritual freedom as central practices of faith. The problem? That directly threatened the hierarchical foundation of the Church, not just the doctrine, but the very idea of spiritual authority. And when a millennia-old structure feels it is about to lose control, its reactions can be swift and silent. Night before his death, John Paul I is said to have made a note in his diary, which was never officially released. The note, leaked by a former Vatican librarian, read only, "The spirit is ready, but the system is not, and perhaps never will, be." An enigmatic phrase, or a conscious farewell? Everything suggests he knew the risks. And even so, he seemed willing to try. What exactly did he see in the Codex Submentalis? And why was its reading so impactful? And what if the true cause of his death was never biological, but spiritual, the result of touching a secret that could not be revealed? Not all power within the Church is visible. Beyond the cardinals, beyond the official religious orders, there is something more discreet and much older. Fragmented reports speak of a select group known only by symbolic names: the custodians, the veiled order, the watchers of the vortex. Few knew of their existence. Fewer still knew what they actually studied. But in the most hidden halls of the Vatican, their name was whispered with a mix of reverence and fear. And according to some records, their mission was singular: to protect the knowledge of the mental matrix of reality. The mental matrix would be a kind of global, psychic field, an invisible structure that shapes collective perception, like a vibrational mesh connecting all human minds. The custodians studied how symbols, rituals, and beliefs feed this matrix and define what we call consensual reality. This wasn't just about faith or theology. This was about archetypal psychology, sacred linguistics, consciousness physics, the kind of knowledge that could redefine the boundaries between mind and physical world. According to unpublished documents found among encrypted papers of 18th century Jesuit monks, this order operated in absolute secrecy. They met in strategic locations, crypts, underground libraries, windowless chambers. They discussed the effects of religious symbols on the collective subconscious, tested the emotional response of the faithful to certain liturgies, analyzed the dreams of sensitive monks after prolonged exposure to sacred texts. It was science, but the kind that could never be presented as such. And the most unsettling part, they believed that popular faith itself was a kind of interface, something that keeps the human being connected to a specific reality, as if we were tuned into a mental transmission channel, and that changing that channel was possible, but extremely dangerous. The custodians didn't want to destroy faith. They wanted to keep it operating within a safe range. They weren't villains, but they weren't saints either. They were guardians of a fragile balance between ignorance and awakening. Internal. Tradition says that every pope received in secret guidance from this order, not as a commandment, but as a warning. There are limits to how much can be revealed, and those who ignored that advice rarely remained for long. There are records that John Paul I, Benedict XVI, and even Francis at different times felt the weight of this invisible presence, always watchful, always in the background, always operating in the shadow of faith. But who created this order? And what exactly are they trying to prevent the world from discovering? Perhaps the reality we know depends on this secret, and on it remaining a secret. Sound has always held a sacred place in spiritual traditions. In almost every religion, the universe begins with a primordial sound, the Om of the Hindus, the word of Christianity, the silent vibration of the Kabbalah. But what most people overlook is that these sounds are not merely symbolic. They carry specific frequencies that, according to hidden records kept in the Vatican, have the power to directly affect the structure of human consciousness, and perhaps, ultimately, of the universe itself. Current research in bioacoustics and quantum physics reveals something astonishing. Certain sound frequencies can modify brainwave patterns, alter cell behavior, and even influence the structure of DNA. Sounds organized in harmony, like Gregorian chants, are not merely beautiful artistic expressions. They generate vibrational patterns that act as keys to expanded states of perception. And for centuries, within cathedrals, this knowledge was used without anyone realizing what was truly being transmitted. Sacred chant was not an aesthetic experience. It was a code. In classified internal documents from the 13th century, there are mentions of divine tones that could only be sung at specific times in geometrically precise locations. The combination of architecture, acoustics, and intention created a bridge between sound and the unseen. The monks who chanted these tones were trained not only in vocal technique, but in the energetic discipline that allowed them to access states of union with the divine. In these contexts, sound was treated as a tool and a ritual of opening. Some say that the 7 notes of the musical scale were originally derived from cosmic frequencies observed by ancient initiates, not created arbitrarily. The Western tonal system may have been adapted to keep the human mind within a comfortable but limited vibrational range, and certain variations, such as the 432 Hz or 528 Hz tones, were excluded from liturgical practices for unexplained reasons. But forgotten documents in the Vatican's musical archives speak of these frequencies as access notes to divine consciousness. The lingering question is, why hide something like this? Sound is invisible, but it penetrates the body, alters emotions, shapes mental states. If the frequencies of God really exist, and if some of them have the power to awaken deeper levels of perception, then the silence around this subject is no accident. It's strategic. After all, to control what people hear is, in a way, to control what they are capable of perceiving. And whoever controls perception controls reality. But what if one of these frequencies is closer than we imagine? Perhaps hidden in an ancient hymn or a forgotten liturgy? What would happen if you heard the sound that awakens reality and could never return to ordinary silence? From a young age, we are taught that we are born in sin, that we carry an invisible guilt from our very first breath, inherited from a choice made by 2 characters in a distant garden. But what if that isn't literally true? What if the so-called original sin is actually a symbolic description of an ancestral trauma? Something implanted into humanity's collective unconscious, like a code, a program. Not a moral error, but a break in consciousness, a deep disconnection from our own essence. Psychologist Carl Jung suggested that there are traumas that don't belong to an individual, but to an entire species. Ancient wounds stored in the Ya, collective soul, repeating throughout the ages like echoes of a fall that no one remembers exactly how it began. The myth of Adam and Eve can be viewed through this lens, not as a personal failure, but as the representation of a rupture from the original state of unity. The fall from paradise, in this sense, would be the mind's descent into the illusion of separation. What's most unsettling is that some manuscripts found in 2nd century Gnostic communities, many of which were never officially acknowledged by the Church, speak of this rupture as manipulation, an event led by entities that had an interest in fragmenting human consciousness. These texts describe that the feeling of guilt and unworthiness was not born of choice, but was installed. Like a psychic virus, the myth was told and retold until it became part of the structure of being. The Vatican holds copies of these manuscripts, kept under absolute secrecy. In one particularly controversial passage, it reads, "And they told men they had fallen, but they had merely forgotten." The phrase is an invitation to deprogramming, a reminder that guilt is not destiny, but an idea. And ideas, as we know, can be replaced. But why keep this narrative alive for so many centuries? Why insist that we are born in debt to the sacred? The answer may lie in the power of control that guilt provides. A human being who believes they are wrong from the start becomes easier to guide. They seek redemption, submission, approval. And what if this mechanism still operates today, unconsciously sustaining structures that depend on obedience to exist? Pope John XXIII once hinted in a private homily that guilt is not divine, it is pedagogical, a phrase that was quickly removed from the official records. But what if the true disobedience wasn't eating the fruit, but remembering that there was never any separation at all? Every Sunday, millions of faithful around the world repeat the same gesture. They receive a small piece of bread and a sip of wine in silence and reverence, believing that this is the body and blood of Christ. For many, it's just a symbol. For others, a sacred act. But there is something behind this ritual that is rarely questioned. Why repeat such a simple gesture so many times for millennia? What if it's not just a spiritual remembrance, but a carefully designed energetic operation? Researchers in the field of neurotheology, the science that studies mystical experiences in the brain, have found that repetitive rituals, when associated with deep belief, alter brainwave patterns. They activate mental states of absorption, where the mind becomes more receptive to commands and suggestions. In other words, the communion ritual may not only remind us of the sacred, but install a sense of it within the psyche. And if this is done intentionally, the bread and wine become more than symbols. They become keys. Hidden texts from the Christian esoteric tradition suggest that the Eucharist, in its original form, was a kind of inner alchemy, a rite that, when practiced with full awareness and in conjunction with certain mental states, allowed access to subtler layers of reality. It wasn't just about remembering Christ. It was about becoming Christ for a moment, embodying the frequency of consciousness he represented. And this symbolic fusion, according to these writings, had real effects on the mind and body. Over the centuries, however, the rite was simplified, diluted, and turned into dogma. Little is said about the state of consciousness necessary for the act to have its true effect. It's rarely mentioned that for some initiates, the Eucharist was an energetic portal, not just a tradition. A manuscript attributed to Saint Clement, preserved in private Vatican copies, states, "He who communes without presence feeds on emptiness." That raises an urgent question. How many today perform the ritual without knowing what it truly activates? The body and blood, then, would be living metaphors, expressions of a forgotten spiritual technology that uses the human body itself as a laboratory, a bridge between the material and the subtle. But who stands to benefit from keeping this knowledge dormant? If people knew they possessed within themselves the capacity to access expanded states through conscious rituals, how many churches would need to be replaced by moments of self-connection? How many intermediaries would no longer be needed? And what if the bread wasn't just bread, but an ancestral code, and each communion a reminder of what you are, capable of accessing with no one's permission? Some say that certain statues look back. That's not a metaphor. In some ancient churches, there are reports of people who, after gazing into the eyes of sacred images long enough, entered altered states of consciousness. Sensations of expansion, visions, even spontaneous healing episodes. Coincidence? Or is there something hidden in sacred art that goes beyond aesthetics? The Vatican has never officially commented on these reports, but internal documents suggest that certain icons were sculpted with a very specific purpose, to activate what cannot be explained in words. In traditional religious sculpture, the eyes are designed to follow the observer. But in certain specific statues, like the one of St. Peter in Rome, or some representations of the Virgin Mary in French cathedrals, there is something more. A hidden geometry, an alignment that interacts with the visual and mental field of the observer. Neuroscientists have shown that the human gaze has the power to activate centers of empathy, fear, and reverence? And what if the statues are a symbolic way of mirroring the consciousness of the one who looks at them? Some scholars call this the architecture of presence. The idea that it's not the statue that sees, but that it awakens an internal observer that had been asleep. In esoteric archives associated with 14th century monastic orders, there are precise instructions for positioning images at energetic points within churches. It wasn't decoration, it was psychic engineering. Creating an environment where space, sound, and gaze generate an atmosphere capable of opening inner portals, like a lens made not of glass, but of symbol. And what's most unsettling, these images were not made randomly. Some were said to be shaped based on mystical visions of saints in ecstatic states. Others, according to restricted accounts, were drawn after specific rituals in which monks claimed to have received visual instructions directly from higher planes. The image is not just a reflection of faith, it is an attempt to crystallize a frequency. As if each statue were a fragment of a forgotten visual language that still speaks to those who know how to truly see. There is even an internal Vatican report, dated 1942, that mentions the spontaneous spiritual activation effect in pilgrims before the statue of Saint Cecilia in Trastevere. The reported phenomena ranged from trance states to unexplained changes in pulse and body temperature. It was never officially published, but those who were present left records. They didn't know if it was a miracle or applied spiritual science that had simply been lost to time. And what if those stone eyes weren't made just to be seen, but to remind us of something we've forgotten, and that can only be awakened when someone finally looks back? Do not seek the kingdom of God outside of you, for it is within you. This phrase, attributed to Jesus in the apocryphal Gospels, has been repeated by mystics for centuries, but rarely appears in conventional sermons. Why? Perhaps because it points to something deeply subversive, the idea that we don't need altars, temples, or intermediaries to access the divine. The human mind, in this context, would not merely be an instrument, but the sanctuary itself. And this idea, quietly, has always been known by certain circles within the Church. At the heart of the Vatican, among undisclosed writings, there are commentaries by ancient theologians discussing the concept of templum mentis, the temple of the mind, an internal space cultivated through practice, silence, and intention. A place where connection with the divine does not depend on external ritual, but on a shift in consciousness. St. Augustine once wrote that, "God is closer to me than I am to myself." A poetic thought, or a truth about how reality works that we were never told. Modern science is beginning to flirt with this view. Neuroscience research shows that deep spiritual experiences are not hallucinations, but specific brain activations. Meditation, for instance, lights up areas linked to compassion, expanded perception, and the sense of unity with all things. The mind, when stilled, reveals a vast, silent, almost sacred inner space. And what if the true experience of God is less about believing and more about perceiving? What if the altar was always behind the eyes, not in front of them? For centuries, spiritual masters have been persecuted for saying this. The Gnostics, the Sufi mystics, certain Christian monks, all suggested that the true temple is invisible and that the divine reveals itself in inner silence. Many were condemned for heresy, not for denying God, but for denying the need to go through someone else to find him. This vision threatens the institutional model of faith. After all, how can you maintain control over someone who discovers they can access the sacred on their own? Internal documents reveal that some popes were aware of this. An anonymous journal, attributed to a counselor of John XXIII, describes private conversations in which the pontiff questioned, "And what if the Church is just the map, and the destination lies within each human being?" These notes were never made public, but remain stored in private archives where faith and philosophy meet in silence. A map can guide, but never replace direct experience. And perhaps that was the best-kept secret of institutionalized spirituality. But if the temple is within, what keeps us from entering, other than the idea that we need permission? In a forgotten corner of the Vatican's secret archives, there is mention of a sound that cannot be written, a lost phoneme, an ancestral vibration that, according to the records, dismantles the illusion of form. Some called it verbum ultimum, the final word. But it's not about grammar, it's about frequency, about a sound that resonates so deeply within the self that it doesn't just touch, it disarms. It is not chanted in Mass, not present in liturgical songs or sacred hymns. Its existence is denied, yet it is documented. Why? Studies in particle physics and vibration have already proven that sound has the power to reorganize matter. Specific. Frequencies can move sand, alter water molecules, even induce altered states of consciousness. Now imagine a sound that doesn't just reorganize, but reveals. A sonic password capable of breaking the mental structure that holds us in the belief of a fixed, separate world. This is what certain initiates, from ancient orders never publicly acknowledged, claim to know. And some believe that the sound still echoes in silence. In records from the 16th century, attributed to a monk named Bartolomeo of Arezzo, there is a description of an experiment conducted with chants in isolated chapels. After hours of repetitive intonations, the monks reported visions, encounters with beings made of light, and in some cases, the sensation of completely disappearing. Bartolomeo himself writes, "I did not see God. I ceased to be myself, and there was only sound." The Church archived these writings as private mystical experiences, but the texts suggest something more, a method. This final key wouldn't be accessible through technique or rational study. It requires a specific state of mental and emotional surrender, an alignment between intention, sound, and silence. And according to internal sources, there was a group of priests trained in this practice, authorized to test it under strict supervision, never in public. The fear was clear. If someone discovered that reality could be rebooted through a vibration, what would happen to all the systems that rely on controlling the collective mind? The key, they say, wasn't hidden out of malice, but out of fear. Fear that humanity, still unprepared, might use this power without responsibility. But does that argument still hold today? With so many awakening, so many seeking, so many feeling that reality is more than walls, rules, and narratives. Perhaps the sound is already vibrating, very softly, waiting to be recognized. Perhaps it never stopped. We just stopped listening, and what if that vibration is still within you, waiting for the exact moment to be remembered? What if the final secret is not something to be said, but heard, in the silence where no one else dares to enter?